Hi, everyone. My name is Jenny Lombard. I'm one of the college and career counselors at Webster Groves High School. I work with students last names L through Z, and I'm here to share some information with you about college admission testing. As we navigate the world of college admissions each year, this information definitely takes a lot of changes, and the information that I'm presenting to you tonight is what we have available for students right now. But just aware that obviously those things can change year to year. But hopefully this gives you a good idea on kind of what to expect as you navigate this world. So today I'd love to share some information, just basically what are these tests? How do we use them? What do they tell us, and what do they tell colleges who might be interested in those scores? We'll talk a little bit about some of the other tests that might come up, the PSAT for one, which is one students start to get exposed to as a sophomore. We'll talk about the differences between the ACT and the SAT, just in what they cover and what they test. And then we'll talk a little bit about how testing plays into the college admission timeline. So from sophomore year through senior year, where do these tests fall? When should you take them? When should you register for them? We'll go through that. And then we'll talk a little bit about test optional admission, which has definitely come into play with students who are applying to college each year. So we've got a couple of great slides that we received from our partners at the Princeton Review that I think are just interesting to see about, what admission tests are for. What are they measuring? Do they measure your intelligence? No. Are they used to award scholarships and financial aid? Yes. Do they reflect your GPA in high school? Not always, so I'd say false on there. Do they predict your college GPA? Usually not. Can you, can it tell you what you're prepared for in college? Yes, they do give you an indication of your college readiness. Do they tell you some places where you could grow? Absolutely. Do they test with what you've learned in high school? Sometimes they do, but oftentimes they don't. So these tests are often misconstrued as like almost like an IQ test. That certainly is not the case. Obviously, no test is perfect, and standardized tests are just one piece of the puzzle when it comes to college admission. So while they are important and we emphasize their importance, they're certainly not an indicator of a student's ability to succeed in college and beyond. So you'll see those questions answered there for you. Okay. So the first test I'll talk about, which is sort of a standalone test, is the PSAT. So you may have recalled us sending information about signing up for the PSAT, which is a test that we offer as an option for students. So it's offered first for sophomores, just as an introduction to standardized testing, just getting their feet wet with the whole concept of taking a standardized test. So this test is offered on a nationally decided date, typically in mid-October each year. We offer it during the regular school day. It runs about 3 hours, just as all of the other admission tests do. And it costs about $20 for students to take. So for juniors, oftentimes if they're taking it for a second time, junior year is when it has a bit of a higher stake for some students. So really it is a good preview to the SAT as a standardized test, as it's structured very similarly to the SAT. And it also is used to determine your eligibility or your qualification to the National Merit Scholarship Competition. So each year, students who take the test as juniors, their scores from the test are used and compared to other students who've taken the test in our state. So the students who are scoring in the very, very top, half of 1% in the state, gives them certain levels of distinction in the competition. So you'll find the students who are commended, and then the semifinalist standings, typically, at our school, it can be anywhere from 1 student to 5 students. And then also finalist standing, which has an application process. So the base score that a student earns as a junior is what will enter them into the competition if they choose. And so basically the scholarships that could be offered would be coming from either corporate sponsors of the scholarship competition or from a collegiate space. So it could be a specific college or university that says, hey, any student who has, the semifinalist or the finalist standing can qualify for this amount of scholarship. So sometimes those scholarship awards can be, up to full tuition in some cases. Sometimes with some of the corporate scholarships, they are about $2,500. But it's certainly something great to put on a college application if you are scoring in the very top on the PSAT. This doesn't exclude you from getting any scholarships if you don't score well on the PSAT, and the PSAT is not a score that any college would see in the admission process. So this certainly is just for practice. The practice is the P of the SAT, and then entry into the scholarship competition. So hopefully that clears up some information about the PSAT and gives you an idea of what to expect when you see that email come across your screen for registration to the PSAT. So our partners at Princeton Review have this chart, which I think is really interesting for us to check out, but basically just kind of describes the basic differences between the ACT and the SAT. What we do know is that there is no preference by colleges over which test you submit as part of your application. So the SAT and ACT have both come under many formats in the last few years. They have added sections, taken away sections, with the writing, with the subject tests. So at this point, these are the basic sections and the content areas that the ACT and the SAT cover. They are both exclusively multiple choice for the regular portions of the exam. And then the content areas, or what they're covering, are covered here. So in the ACT, you'll see more English, so technical writing and sentence structure, things like that. Grammar covered on the ACT that you may not see on the SAT as much. And there's also a science reasoning portion on the ACT that uses science-related questions to have students kind of draw conclusions and answer those multiple choice questions. So just slight differences between the two tests in terms of content areas. The scoring is probably the biggest difference. Each section of the ACT is scored out of 36, and the SAT is just 2 sections scored out of 800. So both of the tests are just around 3 hours. If you took the optional writing portion, it would take you closer to 4 hours. And there are quite a few more questions on the ACT than the SAT. So just some basic differences between the tests. Again, not one over the other preferred by colleges. So the scoring on the ACT and SAT is quite different, like I mentioned. So on the ACT, each section of the test, the English, math, reading, and science, all have an equal portion averaged into your composite score. So out of each section, you're going to score up to 36 on the exam, and then the composite score will be an average score. So when someone asks your ACT score, they're referring to that composite or that average score of those 4 different sections. Same thing with the SAT. So there's 2 main sections on the SAT, and those scores, instead of being averaged, are totaled up to give a total score out of 1,600, and that would be considered your SAT score. So we do have charts, and there are plenty of charts available online to figure out the equivalent scores between an ACT and an SAT. And so if you're curious about those conversions, I can certainly direct you in that direction for that information. The ACT average score in our state is just above a 20 on the ACT, and our school's average ACT score in the last year is about a 23. So we have a pretty high average on our school, at our school. For the amount of students who take our tests, it's something we're pretty proud of. So 23 being the average that our students have as a ACT score by graduation. Something you may have heard of is an ACT super score. So some schools will give you the opportunity to present your highest score from each time you've taken the test in each of the sections. So if I take the test in September, and I get a 36 in the English, but in September I get a 30 in the English, then you're able to report the higher score from each time you took the test. So for many students, taking the test 2 to 3 times and providing a super score may give them a higher composite average. And so that higher score can be used in some cases for admission and for scholarships. So typically we do see students take the test 2 to 3 times. One time is definitely required, and students typically will try to retest to see if they can improve their score. So there's some benefit to taking it, retaking it, just to improve your score, and then also to hopefully benefit from the super score if a college requires it. The essay portion or the writing portion of the ACT is still around. It never really latched on as a required portion of the test for most schools. So there are very few schools who require the written portion of the ACT. The SAT recently dropped the written portion of the SAT. And so a lot of schools are sort of going away from that written portion, although it is still an option for some students to complete that on the ACT. So as you get closer to the admissions process and the application process, it'll be very clear if a school requires the written portion of the ACT. So initially when students are taking the test, we're okay if they don't take it the first time. And then as they get their list of schools together, they're going to double check and make sure they, don't need that written portion. So here are some scores, and these are from about 2 years ago, but I would say in my general, my experience, and this is pretty true. So as we talk about the average score for our students who, graduate from Webster Groves High School, they land right around a 23. I would say that's pretty average. And so you can see just in our state, the range is pretty, it's different depending on the school. So these are the average ACT scores of their entering freshman class at the different schools. So obviously you can see here on the lower end of this chart is Missouri State University. Mizzou's just above that. And then some of the other schools kind of landing in that mid-20s to early 30s range, with WashU being the most selective with admission, and of course also with their ACT scores being in the higher end and closer to that perfect 36. So just an idea, so kind of when we talk about ACT scores, what exact numbers we're referring to. The ACT and SAT are offered several times throughout the year, typically every month or so. And so here are the dates that were offered for this school year. They have not published the dates for 2023 just yet, but typically they're offered the same weeks of the month, just depending on the calendar, the date might change a little bit. For our students, the Webster Groves School District does provide students the opportunity to take the ACT at school at no cost. It is a test that is, part of a graduation requirement, so we do require all students to take that test. And so this year, all of our juniors will take that test on April 5th, which is a Tuesday on a regular school day. We will also take care of the registration and all of those details at school, during the regular school day. So there's nothing for students or parents to do outside of school to register for that April 5th test date for the current juniors. Students, again, may take the test 2 to 3 times, so there's plenty of opportunity to do so. Typically, students will take that test initially in probably December, February of their junior year, with a retest sometime in the summer or even early into the fall, with that September 11th test being pretty popular for seniors as well. To register for the ACT, you can register at act.org. And the registration deadline for each of these different test dates is typically about 6 weeks ahead of the test. So if you have your sights set on April, that deadline is going to come up towards the beginning of March. So it's a good idea, if you sort of know the plan, to go ahead and just register online for the test several weeks ahead. That way you have a spot, especially if you're hoping to test here at our high school. Here are the SAT dates. So here are the ones remaining for this school year. And then obviously the dates that are slated for the fall and into next year as well. Same thing with the SAT, the registration deadlines are typically 6 weeks before the test date. Webster Groves High School offers most of these test dates, which are on Saturday mornings at our high school. We do have a limited amount of seats that we have. So for some of the more popular dates, which tend to be in March and early in the fall, sometimes that can fill up. So if you know that you'd like to take, your test in a comfortable setting and a familiar space, we do encourage you to try to register early so that you can ensure that you can take it here at Webster Groves High School. Okay, so those are the differences really between the tests, and this is how it fits into the greater admission timeline. So in sophomore year, the most important thing in college admission really is just to establish that high school transcript. So in some of our other information sessions, you're going to hear more about, taking challenging classes and getting a good GPA, because that really is the foundation of what your college application will entail. So while these tests are important, they're certainly not the most important thing. And so we really want students to focus early on in freshman and into sophomore year about their full application and what that full high school experience looks like. So taking challenging classes, getting good grades, continuing participation in extracurricular activities. It could be in school, out of school, work experience, volunteering, anything that you are passionate about. We want you to do meaningfully, and really, stick with those commitments. Think about using your summers in a good way. School can get pretty time consuming with taking challenging classes and being involved after school. So really spending your summer to explore different careers, doing camps or programs. Those are a great way to do some things outside of the regular kind of rhythm of our regular school day. Start thinking about college options. It's not necessary to dive into the process as a sophomore, but really just start of opening your eyes and keeping ears open for opportunities to visit campuses maybe when you're on vacation, and just start the talk about different types of careers and thinking about how you best learn and wanting that reflected in a college that you might want to attend. The PSAT, like I mentioned, is available for students to get their feet wet with standardized testing. So that is available in October, so pretty early in sophomore year, and that can give you a good idea on how to approach the college admission testing scene. So maybe an ACT or SAT preference is great. So for sophomore year, that's really where we want students to focus their time. During junior year, I think is sort of when you sort of officially kick off that search and research process. For a lot of our juniors right now, we are meeting with them individually to kind of look at a plan for applying. It is helpful, to have an ACT score and to help at looking at different college admission practices. Junior year is really when also a lot of your classes and things get a little more challenging. There are a lot more dual credit and AP offerings available. We do offer an ACT prep course, and I'll talk a little bit about ACT prep in just a moment, but this is a good way for students to prepare in the regular school day for an upcoming ACT. The PSAT is available in October for students, and that is to practice the SAT, but also to enter into that national merit scholarship competition. And then taking a full college entrance exam is a great idea during junior year. Late fall, early spring is great. And then again, we do plan to test all juniors in April at high school during the regular school day. In addition to that, just starting to think about specific colleges, looking at what they require in terms of the ACT, SAT, GPA, involvement essays, those sorts of things. So we have another session running the college search that we'll be running during our college evening. And so checking that out, kind of figuring out, things that are important to you, that sort of thing, you'll cover in there as well. So research and visit colleges. So really this is where you're doing a lot of planning and preparation. And then senior year is when you're putting it all into action. So in terms of submitting applications, it is possible to retake an ACT or an SAT if necessary. So those early dates in September and October are pretty popular for students looking to get just one more point, or maybe they're trying to kind of work their admission, capabilities or possibilities by increasing their scores. That's definitely possible to get those scores in enough time to submit with applications. We ask students to come back with a handful senior year of schools that they're going to apply to, and then be ready to apply to those by November 1st, which is the first big deadline. Financial aid and scholarships we have covered in a session as well. But obviously that comes into play with testing in terms of trying to qualify for merit-based awards on grades, ACT scores, etc. Okay, so I keep talking about retaking the test, and we always say that it's a good idea, of course, to do some preparation before you take the test, especially a second or a third time. Typically, your score won't magically improve after a second time without some real dedicated preparation for it. So luckily, there's plenty of ways to do that. ACT Prep, we offer as a course. It's a semester-long course for a half credit for juniors to take during the regular school day. And so that's taught by a few different teachers that are building, and they cover different sections of the test. So that English, math, reading, and science will cover, as well as some test taking tips and strategies just to approach the test. So typically that is a good option for many students. If you have a full schedule or looking for some more personalized preparation, there are so many testing companies, tutors, individuals that do a great job with our students getting them prepared for the test. So it really just depends on the time that you have, the resources you have to be able to put into test preparation, but there's plenty of things available. Princeton Review is a partner school to us, and so they offer our students a discount on some of their classes. There's some free resources available too. So Khan Academy has great free test prep. ACT itself has some things available on their website. And we definitely have a list of resources that are available in case you're interested. We don't have any formal SAT prep at our school, but for every ACT prep resource you'll find, you will also find it for the SAT. So we're just very heavy on the ACT in the Midwest and in Missouri. And so that's where we lean in terms of preparation for students and the language that we use for testing. But the SAT is equally, fair game for college admission and for opportunities for preparation. So again, happy to connect you with any resources you need for ACT preparation. Something big that's changed in the landscape of college admission recently is test optional admission. So really coming out of COVID and the pandemic, the biggest thing that students were not able to do during all of the restrictions and lockdowns was find a place to test. So that class of 2020, 2021, that spring that we were in lockdown and there were so many cancellations, really impacted a student's ability to find a place to take an ACT. So in response to that, many colleges decided that they could not require students to have a test score for them to apply for admission. And so obviously we've been dealing with, closures and restrictions and modifications to, regular school practices over the last couple of years. And so colleges have held on to this test optional option for students to apply without a test score. So it has changed and it's changing, and we are getting, emails and information from individual colleges about their policies, almost weekly. So I will say that with the class of 2022 who, have applied to college already for this year, many of them applied with test scores some places and some places without. So just depending on what was required at each individual school. There has not been anything standardized across the board about the test optional admission policy, which can make it confusing but also just requires you to kind of do your best research about what is available in terms of test optional for specific schools. It does vary greatly between different colleges, universities, even within our state. So, just getting the most up-to-date information from the schools is a great idea. I'll take this time to just show you an example of two different schools and their test optional admission policy. So if we look at University of Missouri, so our flagship school, they are very good about putting their admission requirements right on their page. So you can see high school coursework that's required. And they have this language. If you are able to take the ACT or SAT, make sure you send us your score. They can use a super score. So just kind of referencing what I mentioned earlier. And they tell you exactly what you need. As a non-ranking high school, Webster Groves High School, if you have a 24 on the ACT and you have a core GPA on your transcript above a 2.0, that would meet their automatic admission requirements. So if you are a student who does not have a 24, then they can look at your GPA below that. And if there's a big difference between, a high GPA and maybe not great performance on the ACT, there is an option for you to apply test optional. So this is specific to students who will be entering in the fall of 2022. So I'm happy they're making this so clear on their website so you know exactly what to expect. But it gives you specific instructions on how you apply test optional, which is different from the regular application and the regular way that we just checked out on their website. So it gives you very specific information. It also details how scholarship eligibility is considered without a test score. So Mizzou is one of those schools that offers automatic scholarships to students based on their test score. And so they also will consider you without a test score, but they're reviewed differently. It can vary per school, per student, just depending on where your score is landing and how much money you might qualify for with a score or without a score. So this is why students have been doing so many, individualized approaches to each school, because, you may send a test score to Mizzou and that might qualify you for scholarships, but you may not want to send that same score to a school that's a little more selective because you've got a good GPA and you want them to review that. So it varies quite a bit. So I'll show you St. Louis University's language that they're using for test optional. And it varies. So they go through and do sort of a Q&A, but some great questions. Are you available for scholarships if you don't submit a test score? I don't know if it would help or hurt. So, and they say, hey, give us a call. We can have this, conversation with you sort of off the record before you submit anything. If you're applying to a specialized program, that could change things. So for more specialized programs that are more selective, they may need an ACT score that could help you get into a more specialized or selective program. Same thing for an honors college or a scholars program. A direct entry program into veterinary medicine or occupational therapy may require a test score. So lots of different information, and it's great that these sites are so explicit about exactly what they would expect from you in terms of a test score and if you should submit or not. We also have to remember that colleges are trying to recruit you. They are competing for students and they want to find reasons to include you in their class. So they are reasonable in most cases and will really try to look for the best picture of you, as a student and on paper to try to offer you that admission. So again, this varies, but I honestly think because things are changing so frequently, the test optional policy we just read about Mizzou very well could change for the class of 2023. So I would say, about 3 months before that initial deadline, check to see what that requirement is for a test score or what that policy may be considered for a test score for each individual school. So yes, it's an additional piece of information to consider, but a pretty important one, I think, when we are taking a look at admission and scholarship opportunities. All right. So, in conclusion, take all of this information just to kind of educate you and get you started. But we certainly know that each student has a different path and a different walk as they consider what their options are for after high school. So, if you can take anything away from that, just it's all changing. So the facts about the tests remain the same, but how they're used in the college admission process certainly is evolving. There are even schools that are test blind. So all of the UC schools in California, the public schools, no longer consider a test at all. And so they don't need to see and won't consider an ACT or SAT score, no matter how great it is. So, we encourage you to communicate with us. We really start, we're in the middle of meetings with our juniors right now where we are, having conversations specific to each student. And that's really, what we love focusing our time on. So we love forward planning with you all. And our students really do well. They go great places after high school. So while we just talked about testing for 30 minutes, we know that it's not the most important thing. And not the indicator of how life will be for each and every student after high school. So definitely reach out. If you have a last name L through Z, I'll be your college and career counselor. And then if you are at the beginning of the alphabet, Ms. First Straight will be the one that will reach out to you, and you can feel free to contact if you have any questions. So thank you so much for listening, and we hope you have a great night.